Hi Founder fans, Jason here. Welcome to Federalist Read-Alongs, where we will be going line by line through today, Federalist number 31. See if we can't dissect some of that 18th century language, learn what we can about the founders, particularly the Federalists' ideas for why the United States Constitution was the best government ever created, which, since they pretty much created themselves, it seems a little conceited, but we all know how the history worked out. That being said, we are discussing a paper written by Alexander Hamilton today, and I am going to quick humble brag. I finally get to see the touring version of the musical Hamilton tomorrow night. So next week, I will let you know how that went. So if you're new here, make sure you subscribe and hit notifications so you can see that. Without further ado, let's get right into the paper. I am going to note as we move right along here that this is a continuation of the previous paper. As you see, the same subject continued concerning the general power of taxation. So last week, Federalist number 30, Alexander Hamilton, and I'm going to adjust my volume a little bit here, a little loud. Alexander Hamilton did say, hey, we've been talking about this big army we definitely need. You agree with me, right? We need a big army. Okay, moving along, we need the general power of taxation under the Constitution if we want to pay for that army. And in today's discussion, he is going to continue saying just that. Once again for the New York packet, twice in a row for the New York packet, kind of unrare. January 1st, 1788. So we have moved into 1788 officially this time. And let's continue. As always, to the people of the state of New York, let's get right on into this. In disquisitions of every kind, there are certain primary truths or first principles upon which all subsequent reasoning must depend. So when we look critically at something, we need to start with the basic premises. Cool. These contain an internal evidence which, antecedent to all reflection or combination, commands the assent of the mind. So there's a certain truth to every argument that we all need to just kind of accept. Where it produces not this effect, it must proceed either from some defect or disorder in the organs of perception, or from the influence of some strong interest or passion or prejudice. So if something doesn't seem true right off the bat, if there seems something wrong, there either must be something wrong with it, or there must be something wrong with you, aka the way you perceive the discussion we're having, which could be based off interests you already have, passions or prejudices that you already have. Of this nature are the maxims in geometry that the whole is greater than its part. Things equal to the same are equal to one another. Two straight lines cannot enclose a space, and all right angles are equal to each other. So a little bit of math facts here. First time we've done math. This is, I don't know who he's quoting here. I guess this is a maxim or a saying that was common at the time. The whole is greater than the part is, I guess, a saying we still have. Things equal to each other. Yeah, weird. Okay. Anyway, continuing. Of the same nature are these other maxims in ethics and politics, that there cannot be an effect without a cause, that the means ought to be proportioned to the end, and that every power ought to be commensurate with its object, that there ought to be no limitation of a power destined to effect a purpose which it's itself incapable of limitation. So there's a lot to unpack in this one particular sentence, because he's saying these are general maxims of ethics and politics. So that there cannot be an effect without a cause. Something can't happen unless something else makes it happen, politically speaking. Some politician has to do some politicianing for something to happen with the government. This one brief part is fascinating. The ends ought to be proportioned to the means. Now, the common saying, or maxim, is the Machiavelli saying that the ends justify the means. But he is limiting Machiavelli's classic form of politics, saying that it ought to be in proportion to the means. Not necessarily say, Machiavelli was like, you can do terrible things as long as the right outcome happens. Hamilton's not disagreeing with that. He's just saying you can't do too many terrible things to get the right outcome. Just the right amount of terrible things, or to be fair, good things. You shouldn't do more than you have to if you are the government, which is an interesting view. That every power ought to be commensurate with its object. That's a similar saying to the first one, that, every power granted to the government should be essentially, it needs enough power to do its job, more or less. And that's something Hamilton has discussed in previous Federalist papers. That there ought to be no limitation of power destined to effect a purpose which itself incapable of limitation. So if we want to do something like raise a gigantic military, we need to be able to raise a gigantic budget to pay for that military. You can't say you want a big old military and only give us a little bit of money to spend on that big old military, as he was discussing in the last Federalist paper. And there are other truths in the two latter sentences which, if they cannot pretend to rank in the class of axioms, are yet such direct inferences from them, and so obvious in themselves, and so agreeable to the nature and unsophisticated dictates of common sense, that they challenge the assent of a sound and unbiased mind with a degree of force and conviction almost equally irresistible. So what he's saying is, in all that big wordy sentence, basically, the last two things I said, that every power, he's basically saying, if you disagree with what my last sentence, you're a dummy. It should be obvious that, as he said, every power ought to, everything the government needs to do, it ought to be able to do, and all the powers it's given ought to be at the level to accomplish its goals. Continuing. Another nice lengthy Hamilton sentence. If the objects of geometrical inquiry are so entirely abstracted from those pursuits which stir up and put in motion the unruly passions of the human heart, that mankind without difficulty adopt not only the more simple theorems of science, but even those abstruse paradoxes which, however they may appear susceptible of demonstration, are at variance with the natural conceptions which the mind, without the aid of philosophy, would be led to entertain upon the subject. Hi, Alexander, using a lot of words there. This lofty language is essentially saying, reflecting on the previous paragraph, you could use... He's using big, lofty words to say sometimes people distract from big, lofty words, basically. Which is a very Hamilton way to go about things. Now, again, I'll remind you, these are his capitalizations, not mine, but the infinite divisibility of matter, or, in other words, the infinite divisibility of a finite thing extending even to the minutest atom, is a point agreed upon among geometricians, though not less incomprehensible to common sense than any of those mysteries in religion against which the batteries of infidelity have been so industriously leveled. So what he's referencing here, I forget the ancient Greek philosopher who came up with this. It's a famous name. I'm not good with ancient Greek philosophers. But essentially, a football field is 100 yards in America. American football fields, because there are some people who watch from overseas, American football fields are 100 yards long. And if you cut that in half, that's 50 yards. And then if you cut that in half, it's 25 yards. And you keep cutting it in half, it's still a greater number than zero. You can never cut something in half until you get to zero mathematically. Now, of course, you can squeeze your hands together and be like, this is zero, but technically, mathematically, dividing by 2 never gets you to zero. You have to, multiply by 0 or subtract from the same number. If there's a mathematician watching, don't quote me on this. But for some reason, he is referencing this idea that you can never divide in half to get to 0 of a finite thing. So he's somehow going to relate this to politics of the United States Constitution. Troy, he is claiming this aiming at the more educated of New York. Machiavelli, geometry. Yes, that's a good point, Troy. Troy's over here saying that it sounds like Hamilton is really aiming it at the more educated readers at this time. Most of the readers, first of all, would have understood a lot more of this language. Second of all, he is aiming it more specifically at the delegates being voted to the New York Ratification Convention, because the elections were taking place at this time, and most of them were anti-federalists at this time, like 75% of them. We'll get into that conversation another time. But he's aiming this primarily at them, and what's interesting is Hamilton's usually the man of the people when he writes. It's usually James Madison that aims at the more higher class crowd, but that's a really great point, Troy. But in the science of morals and politics, men are found far less tractable. So, not a lot to elaborate on there. For a certain degree, I guess there is some, tractable is a tough word. The mathematicians have this math equation that doesn't make sense, but it works out. In morals and politics, you got to make sense. To a certain degree, it is right and useful that it should be the case. Okay, so that makes sense that politicians can't use fancy equations to say things that don't make sense. Caution and investigation are a necessary armor against erosion and implosion. So you have to be careful and pay attention in politics, or you could do some serious damage. But this untractableness may be carried too far, and it may degenerate into obstinacy, perverseness, or disingenuity. So if you're being too cautious, if you're paying too much attention to reason and logic, then you can get too paranoid, basically. Though it cannot be pretended that the principles of moral and political knowledge have, in general, the same degree of certainty with those of mathematicians, yet they have much better claims in this respect than, to judge from the conduct of men in particular situations, we should be disposed to allow them. So, politicians also have a certain amount of certainty, like the mathematicians. There are certain things you just know. You can't get by. But much more claims to respect than to judge from the conduct of men in particular situations. So even though politicians also have a certain amount of certainty, it isn't like a mathematician who can say something that sounds ridiculous but mathematically works out. The obscurity is much oftener in the passions and prejudices of the reasoner than in the subject. So when there's confusion about a certain situation, unlike mathematics, where it's just because the equation is confusing, but it's correct, usually in politics, it is the politician or that is making things more confusing than they have to be. Men, upon too many occasions, do not give their own understandings fair play, but, yielding to some untoward bias, they entangle themselves in words and confound themselves in subtleties. So men, people, politicians, too easily overlook their own biases when they're discussing politics, as opposed to taking an open-minded perspective look at both theirs and their opponent's understandings. Which Hamilton can look in the mirror. How else could it happen if we admit the objectors be sincere in their opposition, that positions so clear as those which manifest the necessity of a general power of taxation in the government of the Union should have encountered any adversaries among men of discernment? So here we are, finally, almost halfway into the paper, we're starting to talk about the subject at hand. Thank you, Hamilton, for the math lesson, kind of. So he's saying here, if we if we acknowledge that the Anti-Federalists are being genuine in their disagreement with the Constitution, acknowledging that, how could it be that things that are so obvious to the rest of us thinking people that they overlook the obvious? Essentially alluding to, and I'm sure he'll say this in the next sentence, essentially alluding to the idea that they've overthought. As he was saying earlier, the Anti-Federalists are justifiably being critical of a new government being presented to them, but they are really overthinking it. They are being too critical, and if you look for something hard enough, you're eventually gonna find it. Though these positions have been elsewhere fully stated, they will perhaps not be improperly recapitulated in this place as introductory to an examination of what may have been offered by way of objection to them. So we may have already talked about some of the things I'm about to go over, but because we have now moved on to a different topic, the topic of taxation, we're going to have to go back and review some of them to help these Anti-Federalists, who are just way overthinking things, clarify their hearts and minds a little bit. They are in substance as follows. So here's the examples. A government ought to contain in itself every power requisite to the full accomplishment of the objects committed to its care, and to the complete execution of the trusts for which it is responsible, free from every other control but a regard to the public good and to the sense of the people. So, and this is one of Hamilton's main points throughout the Federalist Papers. Every government needs the ability to do what it is entrusted to do. He's always argued that the Articles of Confederation is unable to carry out its duties, which to a degree is absolutely true. It couldn't pay for it. And again, this paper is about taxation. Okay, number 2. Too much highlight. Just highlight happy. As the duties of superintending the national defense and of securing the public peace against foreign or domestic violence involve a provision for casualties and dangers to which no possible limits can be assigned, the power of making that provision ought to know no other bounds than the exigencies of the nation and the resources of the community. If you're new here, that is the word I just can never pronounce. Exigencies. I will mispronounce it every time. That being said, he's elaborating on his previous point, which I already discussed briefly. If we want a government that can defend all of the states from both foreign and domestic problems, then we need that government to have the power to do so. And part of that power is raising the money to pay for the power to do so. Continuing. As revenue is the essential engine by which the means of answering the... Okay, the word exigencies is going to show up a bunch of times here, so forgive me. As revenue is the essential engine by which the means of answering the national exigencies must be procured, the power of procuring that article in its full extent must necessarily be comprehended in that of providing for those exigencies. So again, he's kind of repeating himself here, and we've discussed this several times in previous papers, so I am also repeating myself, but we got to be able to raise that money. You want that army? We need that cash. Give us the bag, baby. As theory and practice conspire to prove that the power of procuring revenue is unavailing when exercised over the states in their collective capacities, the federal government must of necessity be invested with an unqualified power of taxation in the ordinary modes. Since the Articles of Confederation prove that we can't have the federal government, which relies on the separate states to essentially donate money or pay the requested amount, which they're not doing, then the Articles of Confederation cannot raise an army to defend us. It can't do anything because it just doesn't have people, the states, that rather paying up. So therefore, the federal government, the national government, needs the ability to tax, as he said before, in all cases whatsoever, in order to supply money for that army. did not experience evince the contrary, it would be natural to conclude that the propriety of a general power of taxation in the national government might safely be permitted to rest on the evidence of these propositions, unassisted by any additional arguments or illustrations. So, if our experience with the Articles of Confederation were better, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But here we are in this particular situation. But we find, in fact, that the antagonists of the proposed Constitution, so far from acquiescing in their justness or truth, seem to make their principal and most zealous effort against this part of the plan. So he's saying the Anti-Federalists out there seem to be most angry at the national government's ability to tax in all cases whatsoever. But again, as I, Alexander Hamilton, have proven in previous papers, we need to raise an army to defend ourselves together, and we need money for it, and the only way we get that money is, say it with me, an unlimited power of taxation. It may therefore be satisfactory to analyze the arguments with which they combat it. So, this is where it gets fun. Let's take a look at what the Anti-Federalists are saying and talk trash about the Anti-Federalist arguments. This particular paper is fun because, as we've discussed before writing the Federalist with James Madison, Hamilton had wrote two papers under the title Caesar, which was arguing primarily against Cato, which was probably New York Governor George Clinton at the time, a prominent Anti-Federalist set of papers. And Hamilton, as Caesar, was very aggressive and people didn't like it. So he kind of stepped back, talked to Madison and John Jay, and then took a more casual, friendly approach with the Federalists. But here, several months into writing, you can see him starting to get a little agitated with this particular discussion. Also of note, this is written 3 days after the last paper. It went from December 28th to January 1st. So that's 4 days after. Three days after. And that's kind of a long time with Federalist papers. A 3-day gap, no Federalists? Very strange. So let's see what the Anti-Federalists have to say and why Alexander Hamilton thinks they're dummies. So, start here. Those of them which have been most labored with that view seem in substance to amount to this. So, this is the main argument of Anti-Federalists from Alexander Hamilton's perspective. It is not true because the exigency... It's that word. I apologize. It's so in my head that I can't get it out. Let's try. It is not true because the exigencies of the Union may not be susceptible of limitation, that its power of laying taxes ought to be unconfined. So they're saying, the Anti-Federalists are saying, no, there should be a certain limit on the amount of taxes the federal government can collect. Revenue is as requisite to the purposes of the local administrations as to those of the Union, and the former are at least of equal importance with the latter to the happiness of the people. So he's saying the taxes being collected from individuals are just as important to the local towns and counties as they are to the greater union of states and to the happiness of the people. So, too much money going to the national government will be detrimental, in the Anti-Federalist opinion, to both the states, the counties, towns, and individuals themselves. It is, therefore, as necessary that the state government should be able to command the means of supplying their wants, as that the national government should possess the like faculty in respect to the wants of the Union. So, Hamilton believes the Anti-Federalists are saying it's more important for the states to be able to get the tax money from individuals than the federal government. But an indefinite power of taxation in the latter might, and probably would in time, deprive the former of the means of providing for their own necessities, and would subject them entirely to the mercy of the national legislatures. So here Hamilton is getting to the crux of it. Give him credit, he's acknowledging the argument of his opponent very well here, that if you give the federal government unlimited power of taxation, eventually they're going to raise taxes to the point where the states can't tax the people anymore. There either won't be money to go around, or the people just won't be able to bear it. And that is a major argument of the Anti-Federalists, is that if we just let the federal government, the national government, tax whatever it wants, whenever it wants, however it wants, it's going to take all the money, and it's going to essentially eliminate the need for the states. Many argued, although there were a lot of addendums to this particular argument. Hamilton is continuing now as from the Anti-Federalist perspective, as the laws of the Union are to become the supreme law of the land, as it is to have power to pass all laws that may be necessary for carrying into execution the authorities with which it is proposed to vest it, the national government might at any time abolish the taxes imposed for state objects upon the pretense of an interference with its own. So, again, he's continuing the Anti-Federalist argument here. The Anti-Federalist, he is correct. One of the many things they're worried about with this situation is that because the national government can make any laws it wants to collect taxes itself, then what's stopping the national government from making a law that says the states can no longer collect taxes? Very good question, Anti-Federalists. I can't wait to hear Hamilton's response to it. It might allege a necessity of doing this in order to give the efficacy to the national revenues. So, kind of repeating what I just said, the national government, the Anti-Federalists were scared, might eliminate the need for states to collect taxes because the federal government needs it. And thus, all the resources of taxation might by degrees become the subjects of federal monopoly, to the entire exclusion and destruction of the state governments. So once the federal government, again, this is the conclusion of his review of a major Anti-Federalist argument against the Constitution, that once the federal government starts collecting all the taxes and they make laws saying the states can no longer collect taxes, eventually, what's the point of the states? The federal government's taking all the money, the states can't fund themselves, and fall into exactly the situation that Hamilton is complaining about regarding the Articles of Confederation. Take a quick sip of water here. Because all this wonderful talking I'm doing, thank you for coming. Do me a favor, hit like while I'm highlighting this next sentence. This mode of okay, back to Hamilton. So that was Hamilton review, essentially summarizing a major Anti-Federalist argument. Here's his response. This mode of reasoning appears sometimes to turn upon the supposition of usurpation in the national government, and at other times it seems to be designed only as a deduction from the constitutional operation of its intended powers. So two things here. First, he's saying the Anti-Federalists seem to be scared that the national government is going to take all the power from the states. And it also seems that they are attempting to, we'll say, hate on the Constitution and some of the powers it is granted. More or less. It is only in the latter light that it can be admitted to have any pretensions to fairness. Wait, what? It is, so he's saying only the second half. Okay, so he's saying it's not the national government trying to usurp all the powers. Let's go back to this part of the sentence here. At other times, it seems to be designed, so the reasoning, only as a deduction from the constitutional operation of its intended powers. So they're trying to reduce the powers of the Constitution. So in the latter light, it can be meant to have any pretension of fairness. Oh, okay. So these first two sentences, what he's saying, more or less, is so the Anti-Federalists are saying all these complaints. The first one is the national government is trying to take all the powers. That's not true. And the second thing they're saying are just trying to hurt the Constitution and make it weaker. And because of that, the only thing that's true is that. I'm saying this wrong. Let me try this again. The Anti-Federalists are trying to make the Constitution look bad. That's the only thing they're doing. To be fair, they're just trying to make it look bad. Their good arguments have no weight. Their bad argument is just a bad argument. Kind of dumb, Hammy. Let's see if he talks about the first part. Oh, got a stink bug in here. The moment we launch into conjectures about the usurpations of the federal government, we get into an unfathomable abyss and fairly put ourselves out of the reach of all reasoning. Okay, I accidentally went too many sentences. So he's going back to the actual argument here that the national government is going to assume all the powers of the state governments. And he's saying here, once we start talking about that, we have lost all reasoning. Oh no, the federal government's coming to get us. And it's like, before he gets, see, this is something about Hamilton and the way Hamilton writes. I will repeat, as I've done in almost every one of these reviews, the Federalist Papers are propaganda. Please don't leave. It is true. He is writing a political pamphlet to the public, trying to sway their opinion on contemporary politics. And this discussion here, before he lays out his reasoning for why he doesn't think there's going to be the national government assuming the powers of the states, first he says that to think that means you have no reasoning. And he brushes off the argument before he even gets into the discussion. Essentially putting in your mind that the ideas of the Anti-Federalists are stupid. Now that you know they're stupid, here's what I have to say. And because I said they're stupid, you're probably going to think I'm smart. It's very good writing style if you're trying to write propaganda. But I wanted to put that in your mind as we go into this. I'm not saying what he's about to say is wrong. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying we should acknowledge that. Continuing. Imagination may range at pleasure till it gets bewildered amidst the labyrinth of an enchanted castle, and knows not on which side to turn to extricate itself from the perplexities into which it has so rashly adventured. So again, he's essentially repeating the same thing, trash-talking his opponents before he presents his own opinion. The whole first part of this paper was talking about geometry and math, and how if you think too hard, if you look too hard for something, you're going to find it, even if it's not there. And the problem isn't with people looking critically at the Constitution. It's them looking so critically, they're blinded to all fairness. And here he is saying that, oh, the Anti-Federalists, their minds are bewildered amidst labyrinths of an enchanted castle. Okay. Again, he's not arguing anything. He's talking he's like, if he said someone's name in this paper, he probably would have been challenged to a duel with this kind of language. Not that Hamilton wouldn't be challenged to a duel. Whatever may be the limits or modifications of the powers of the Union, it is easy to imagine an endless train of possible dangers. And by indulging in excess of jealousy and timidity, we may bring ourselves to a state of absolute skepticism and irresolution. See, if he started with this sentence, I wouldn't have been so critical on him. What he's saying here is, no matter what government we have, all governments come with a little bit of danger. And if you look long enough for dangers, you're going to find it in any government, even if you like it. And because of that, we can be in a state of constant fear about it. See, that is a reasonable, rational sentence. No smearing your opponents, just straight information. I repeat here what I have observed in substance in another place, that all observations founded upon the danger of usurpation ought to be referred to the composition and structure of the government, not to the nature or extent of its powers. So he's alluding to previous papers he's written where, if you want to criticize the government, look at the Constitution, criticize how it's written, criticize the government itself, not the powers it's given. As Hamilton assumes, if you're reading the 31st of his Federalist Papers, you probably agree with a good amount of what's being said, or at least are open-minded enough to be considering it back in the 1780s. At this point, you probably agree with him on all the papers he's written about the need for a more powerful army and how, in order to fund that, you need this ability to tax at any place. So don't criticize these particular powers we need. You can criticize the way it's written if you're afraid it might lead to something worse. To be fair, what the Anti-Federalists were criticizing, that he even acknowledged in his summary earlier of Anti-Federalist thought, was, well, what if the what if all powers necessary and proper to tax in all cases whatsoever mean they'll get rid of, you know, you get it. Continuing. The state governments, no, I went too far. This is a really short sentence, Hamilton. The state governments, by their original constitutions, are invested with complete sovereignty. So the saying here, and we like to overlook this nowadays, but the state governments are essentially separate countries. At this time, they were separate countries. That's how they looked at themselves. That's how, in essence, they operated. That's why the Articles of Confederation were so weak. The Articles of Confederation even note in the first sentence that the states are, it is a firm league of friendship where the states retain their sovereignty. So, again, it's hard for us to review it from that perspective nowadays, but that is how they looked at it at the time. And it's important to keep that in the back of our minds when we look at this discussion. But let's ask some questions. In what does our security consist against usurpation from that corner? Oh, okay. So the states' constitutions are separate countries. So how do the state constitutions prevent usurpation or tyranny in the separate states? Doubtless, in the manner of their formation and in a due dependence of those who are to administer them upon the people. The reason the state constitutions don't devolve into a dictatorship is because the way they were created, and that the governments need to make sure they're pleasing the people or they'll be ousted. To be fair, he's kind of ignoring the Shays Rebellion he brings up so often. But you know, continuing. If the proposed construction of the federal government be found, upon an impartial examination of it, to be such as to afford, to a proper extent, the same species of security, all apprehensions on the score of usurpation ought to be discarded. So, if the national government is made and written similarly to all the state constitutions, then, and you're not scared of the state constitutions, then you should have nothing to be scared of the national constitution. In fairness, that makes a good deal of sense. You know, it's the same thing, just bigger. So what's the difference? To which many of the Anti-Federalists would say it's much bigger and you'll be further removed from the people, yada, yada, yada. We'll get into those arguments in another day. It should not be forgotten that a disposition in the state governments to encroach upon the rights of the Union is quite as probable as a disposition in the Union to encroach upon the states. So, for more or less, for in one state or the other to try and take power from the Articles of Confederation, take power over its neighboring states, that is just as likely as the national government trying to take it back. I said that wrong, but I think you see my point. You know, it's just as likely the states try and usurp power as it is the federal government does. What's the difference? What's the deal with that? Yeah, we got a Jerry Seinfeld impression. What do you know? Not my best. What side would be likely to prevail in such a conflict? Excuse me one second. A lot of reading. What side would be likely to prevail in such a conflict? Must depend on the... Let me read this again. What side would be likely to prevail in such a conflict must depend on the means which the contending parties could employ towards ensuring success. Getting the words out. I can do it. The sentence he's saying, if the Union was trying to assume power from the states, or the states were trying to assume power from the Union, the party, the states or the Union, the one that would win that battle, so to speak, political battle, probably not a military battle, but the one would win, could employ towards, must depend, let me read this again, must depend on the means, so their means, their ability to actually have this either physical or political battle. And the means are money, as we will see. Let's see, pretty long sentence. So I'm going to break this up into parts. As in republics, strength is always... Man, it's the first pair. I have, 31 Federalist papers, and I haven't had a problem starting sentences like these last 3 sentences. We can do it. As in republics, strength is always on the side of the people, And as there are weighty reasons to induce a belief that the state governments will commonly possess most influence over them, the natural conclusion is that such contests will be most apt to end to the disadvantage of the Union. So we live in a republic, and a republic needs the people to support it. The leaders are elected, they need the people. And he's acknowledging here that the states are more closely representative of the people, and therefore the states will always have more loyalty of the people. And therefore, in a disagreement with the federal government, the people will usually side more with their states than with the national government, which, you know, we try not to talk about modern politics here, but that seems to be pretty not true. Most people can name, their states, their United States senator, but they probably can't name their state senator. Not founder fans, of course. We are all very much aware of our local government, I presume. I went too far, so this sentence does end here. And that there is greater probability of encroachments by the members upon the federal head than by the federal head upon the members. So there's a better chance that the states are going to encroach upon the power of the federal government than the federal government taking away the powers of the states. And I don't think it's talking about modern politics to acknowledge that he was wrong. But it is evident that all conjectures of this kind must be extremely vague and fallible, and that it is by far the safest course to lay them altogether aside, and to confine our attention wholly to the nature and extent of the powers as they are delineated in the Constitution. So, this example I'm giving is pointless, more or less what he's saying. The idea that the states or the federal government will take powers. No. Like, the federal government can't take power from the states. The states the people are too closely relied on the states than the federal government. Don't worry about it. So the powers of the federal government, don't even worry about it. It's pointless to even talk about. To which I would say, hey bro, anyway, everything beyond this must be left to the prudence and firmness of the people, who, as they will hold the scales in their own hands, it is to be hoped, will always take care to preserve the constitutional equilibrium between the general and the state governments. So the real important part of this whole conversation that I only just brought up at the end, Hamilton, is the people, the people's role in this scenario. The people, as he says, it is to be hoped, will make sure the federal government and the state governments play nice. And last sentence here. Upon this ground, which is evidently the true one, it will not be difficult to obviate the objections which have been made to an indefinite power of taxation in the United States. So, in conclusion, you obviously agree with me, Alexander Hamilton, that the indefinite power of taxation, the ability to lay any taxes on anything, whenever, wherever, should be granted to the national government. And as always, Publius. Wasn't that fun? So, Mr. Hamsalot comes in here. He does, in Federalist 31, fix my hair, he does a really good job, actually, of analyzing the Anti-Federalist argument about granting an unlimited power of taxation to the national government. He really reflects on, I should say first, the Anti-Federalist argument being that if the federal government can collect any taxes it wants, eventually it's going to collect all the taxes and make laws that say the states can't collect taxes, and eventually make the states irrelevant, and there will be one national government so removed from the people that they will have no control over what's happening. To which Hamilton basically says, no, that will never happen. And we don't talk about modern politics on this channel, but you can see what I'm alluding to, I presume. I personally don't necessarily think Hamilton was right. With the benefit of hindsight, that is. Easy for me to say. As for the paper itself, yeah, he more or less just continues. I'm saying more or less a lot today. I apologize for that. Basically continues the same discussion, which is, hey, we need the power of taxes if you want to raise a government that will protect itself. The part at the end is interesting. He's saying that the people will make sure the balance between the states and the national government, they will take the side of the states. There's no way they'll ever see themselves as Americans instead of Virginians or New Hampshireans, New Hampshireites, New Hampshirers, or Connecticuters. I know almost every state I could probably name every state capital, but I'm surprised how few names of residents of states I actually know. Connecticuters? I feel like it should be Connecticuters. Virginians. I got Virginians. I know New Yorkers. That one's simple. Troy Cummins. Is it that he wasn't right, or was he hiding what he knew would likely develop? Okay, Hamilton being a real Troy. Hamilton being a real Troy. Troy being a real Hamilton conspiracy theorist over here on the live video. Which of you are watching this in the future? These are live, so make sure you come next week on Tuesdays. I don't think Hamilton was... I don't know, Troy. I don't know what Hamilton was thinking. Are you alluding to the idea that was Hamilton trying to convince people to overthrow the Articles of Confederation and have a coup to install this new constitution where he would have immense power? Maybe. Did he genuinely believe that that would never happen? Probably. I like to make the argument that Alexander Hamilton is the only founder who, if they woke up today, most founders would wake up today and be like, iPhones, oh my goodness, oh man, look at nuclear, whatever, you know, like power, oh, driving cars, oh man, and Hamilton would wake up and look around and be like, this is exactly what I wanted. You know how no Americans on either side of the aisle really think things are going well right about now? Alexander Hamilton would be like, this is perfect. This is exactly the way it should go. Logan, love this video. Very important. Thank you, Logan. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. We do this every Tuesday. We have relocated trivia back to Fridays now that I'm not bowling that day anymore. So make sure you come Friday. And hopefully doing another fun video on Saturday this week. Nick, people from Connecticut are called Connecticuter. When I write Connecticut, I write like Connecticut. That's still how I remember it from elementary school. Connecticuter doesn't sound right. Connecticuteer, I think, is from here on out what we're going with. So, right, if you live in Connecticut, write your local politicians. Tell them we've already made the adjustment. Oh, I guess. Got warm. Got some stink bugs flying around in here. They just got in, and that one spooked me. I'll be quite honest with you. With that, let's wrap up this week. Thank you guys so much for watching. As I said earlier at the beginning of the stream, you can envy me. I am going to see the musical Hamilton tomorrow on tour, coming through Central New York. Very excited. First time. And so I will let you know in the future how that goes. I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful night out with my spouse, because we haven't been able to do that very much in several years, between the plague and not really living close to family and having anyone to watch the kids. All right. Thank you, Logan, Nick, Troy, anyone else who is watching. Thank you so much for coming. As always, you guys have any questions, contact me on the social media. And if you want to support the channel, check out the Patreon page. Been a little bit behind in some of the live videos for the Patriots on Patreon, but we have a bunch coming up. It's going to be a ton of fun. Thank you very much. And I will leave you now. And I will end with, I am your humble and obedient servant, and I'll see you very latest for trivia on Friday. I hit the wrong button again, every time. Well, this is from last week's video. Haven't updated that yet. Okay, bye, guys.